Going on, guys? It's me, Zach Steele, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. In this one, I'm going to go over 5 tips I found to be really helpful during auction drafts. I personally really love getting involved in some auction drafts over the last few years. I would highly recommend trying to switch your league to an auction draft if you can. I think they're a lot of fun, and they really increase the amount of preparation you have to have for your draft. And I think it's a lot more involved too, because you're not just sitting around waiting the whole time. Um, but they're also more challenging, so I think it's really important that people sort of understand how I approach them and what tips I go into drafts looking to follow. And I don't think there's really enough content out there talking about auction drafts, so it can be hard to figure out what you want to do. Um, so yeah, if you guys do like this video, get anything out of it, please do give me a thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. We do 3 videos a week. Maybe even we'll up that come start of the actual season. But really enjoying putting out all this content for you guys, and I'm still really hoping to hit to 100 subscribers by the start of the season. We're at 78 right now, so we got to do 22 more, and it's about 1 a day. So we can do it. And yeah, so with that, thank you again, and let's get into the first tip. First tip I really like to follow is to budget $2 for every single bench player on your roster. I think the standard advice is to budget $1, because obviously that's going to result in a better starting lineup. But I think that there's a lot of value lost in only having $1 left at the end of each of the draft for each of your players. By ADP, the pre-draft value or average price of players falls to about $1 around round 10. So that means that if you have $2 for all of your bench players, that makes your entire bench capable of being at least a 10th round value, rather than basically finding yourself in a snake draft where anyone with extra money can just steal your pick. Um, so it really, I found that does drastically increase the quality of your bench. You'll feel like you have a lot deeper team just by having those $2, and you'll feel like you actually have some sense of control. Um, over how the draft is going. If you only have $1 left and somebody else nominates a player, then you can't bid on them, as to where if they do nominate the player you want and you have that $2, you can still be involved. So it really helps you get all the guys you do want at the end of the drafts, and you're not going to end up with as many guys that you're just have no confidence in. And it doesn't cost you much extra money. Most teams have a 7-player bench, so it's going to cost you an extra $7 over the course of your draft, and you will end up with a much better bench and a lot more depth than a lot of your league mates. And like I said, it's just not all that costly, and it's more than worth it to do that. The next tip I think is really important is to not wait until the last player during a certain tier is nominated to start bidding on that player. Rather than setting a maximum bid that you'd be willing to pay for each individual player during the course of your draft, I think it's really important to go into your draft with a tier list and then define how much you would pay for each of those tiers. So maybe that's, I think Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews are both tier 1 tight ends, and I will pay up to 40 of my $200 or whatever, 20% of my budget to get them. But what you'll see is that, say, Kelce is nominated and goes, and then Mark Andrews is nominated, you're going to see Mark Andrews get a lot more expensive, because if you and a couple other people were really banking on getting a tier 1 tight end, now there's only one left, and you're going to find yourself in a bidding war. So even if maybe you do prefer one or the other, it's important to make sure you bid on the other players you have in that same tier, because it keeps you from finding yourself in a bidding war at the end of that tier, and it also might help you find value during the process of that earlier player getting nominated. And it really helps you not pigeonhole yourself into certain players. Say you've done all of these mock drafts, and in all of them you've gotten Mark Andrews or Kelce, but you really like Mark Andrews, so you let Kelce go, and then Mark Andrews comes up and he ends up being 20% more expensive than you wanted him to be. That's really going to throw off the rest of your draft. So it's important that you understand that you want to do everything you can to find yourself avoiding those bidding wars that'll happen at the end of these tiers, and the easiest way to do that is just to be involved throughout the entire duration of the tier. Next piece of advice is to nominate players that you want your league mates to draft. The common cliche you'll see is to nominate players that you don't want, so that your league mates spend that money on the players you don't want, and then the players that you do want get nominated while the rest of your league has less money. And that makes a lot of sense, but I think that you can be a little more strategic than that. I think that one tip I found to be very helpful is to nominate players that are at the end of that tier, because you want that bidding war to happen before your draft comes up. You want your league mates to overpay for players, and you don't want to fall on that landmine yourself. So An example here would be, say, Josh Allen and Herbert have already been nominated and drafted, and you personally don't want Mahomes. You should then nominate Mahomes because he's going to be a very expensive quarterback that might find his way into a bidding war because he's the last of the commonly perceived tier one quarterbacks. Um, and same thing, if there's a player you identify as a bust that's going for really expensive, nominate him because you want your league mates to draft him because you have some level of control over what your league mates draft when you do get to nominate. So it's just important to be a little more strategic during that nomination than simply drafting players or nominating players you don't want. Next tip is pretty self-explanatory, but it's just to not draft scared. The worst thing you can do during an auction draft is leave the draft with a bunch of unspent dollars. You can't take them with you; they're not going to roll over. You don't get any bonus points for drafting a team with less money than your league mates. So if at any point you find yourself with the most money in the league at some point during the draft, just know that means it's time for you to spend money. You might even have to overpay for players, but it's better to overpay for players than it is to just not get them and then find yourself in a position where you just can't spend all the money you have. You will feel immediately after the draft like you went into the draft and just missed out on a couple picks, and you don't want to have that feeling at the end of the draft. I'm not saying you need to always draft down to spending 100% of your budget because that's going to be hard to budget. Maybe you'll get some values at the end of the draft that just make that impossible, but it is important to know that the the worst thing you can do is leave the draft with 20% of your money or whatever left. So, um, I generally like to try and find myself, um, not with the least money in the draft because you do find it hard to get players you do want, but I want to find myself somewhere in the middle, during the course of the draft in terms of how much money I have remaining. Because if you find yourself at the top, then you end up having to buy everybody, and if you have extra money and somebody else does as well, then you're both doing the same thing, trying to overpay for players, and you'll end up spending twice as much as a player's pre-draft value on them, and it's just hard to win that way. Um, so this almost sort of links itself to spending money early and often, and then taking value as you get it during the course of the draft. But if you do try and be more patient, just make sure that you know that by being patient, you're forcing yourself to spend that money in the middle rounds, and you have to do it because otherwise you're not going to be able to. And the last piece of advice I like to give is to bid on every single player. Obviously, you don't go into the draft wanting every single player, but um, almost every player you will want at some cost. Maybe, for example, you're out on Ezekiel Elliott and his pre-draft value is 15% of your budget. And maybe you're only willing to spend 10, but then you should bid up to 10 because um, in an auction draft, it does require everybody to be paying attention, and you might be able to catch your league mates in a sequence where they aren't paying attention, and then you'll get that bargain. And if you simply don't bid because it's a player you don't want, you'll find yourself missing out on that. And just getting one big bargain like that during the course of your draft really can tip the scales on how your team looks at the end of it. And I think that it's something that a lot of players fail to do is they'll just see a player get nominated they don't want, and they just won't bid at all, as to where they should know going into the draft how much they'd be willing to spend on that player because, like I've mentioned previously, they came in with a tier list. They've placed that player in a tier, and they know how much he's worth to them. Um, and on top of that, I've personally found that in a lot of my home leagues, you'll have league mates sort of bid you up on players just because they can, and they don't want you to get value. So bidding on every player sort of makes it harder for your league mates to identify which players you actually do want. Um, so it sort of protects yourself from getting run up on a bunch of these bids because then you will find yourself in a spot where they don't know which players you are 100% in on, and it just makes it a little easier to avoid that. It's not necessarily a problem, but I'm sure many of you play in leagues with your friends that get just as much joy out of trying to make your draft go poorly as they do about making theirs go well. So it sort of helps protect you from that as well. Um, Sort of on that note, not a slide for that, but that is something I do advise against. It's commonly thought that it's not a bad idea just to bid players up just because you want another person to have to spend more money on them. And I would say that it's never worth placing a bid on a player that you're going to be upset if you win. So it's okay to bid players up just because you're okay with them if you get them. But the worst thing you can do is think a player is going for too cheap that you don't want, bid on them, and then you end up getting stuck with them, and then you just spent $30 that you didn't want to spend, and it really will throw your whole draft in a wrench, and it's just not worth the risk just to make a player spend a couple extra dollars. So if you don't want a player, don't bid on them at that draft price, because, like I said, it's a far worse outcome for you to get them when you don't want them than it would be for the other player to get them for a couple of dollars cheaper than you think they should. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.